Hi, everyone. It's amazing to see everyone here. My name is Brian Landis. I am a senior solutions architect. I've actually been here for about 5.5 years, primarily supporting our global and industry accounts. But lately, we've been really focusing on platform engineering, developer portals, and of course, Backstage. If you are new to reInvent, welcome. I hope you're having a good time. Maybe gambling or drinking a little bit. If that's not your style, there's tons of restaurants and good food and shows, Cirque du Soleil. And if you're anything like me and you hate Vegas, don't worry, we're almost out of here. Before I really kick it off again, I just really do want to thank you. I know how hard it is to get around reInvent. Also, I wanted to say thank you to anybody that's in the Venetian right now. We're actually casting to them at the same time. So I just want to say wholeheartedly, thank you so much for being here. So yeah, welcome to OPN404, Transforming Deployment, Deep Dive into Backstage. I'm here with my friend Mihai from Spotify. I'm very lucky to have him here, and then also my colleague Neil, who both of them will go ahead and introduce themselves in a couple minutes. To kind of go into what we're going to be talking about, quite simply, this is basically the flow. I will ask Mihai to come up here and talk a little bit how Spotify looks at their Backstage, and more importantly, talk about the developer experience. We'll then shift on to a little bit more closer to Backstage on AWS, and then we'll talk about some integration patterns that we see. So yeah, Mihai, would you like to take us Backstage?
Thank you. Our human needs had evolved. In the grand scheme of things, on a scale of time, it feels like yesterday we were still learning to master and control the fire. Whereas nowadays, we fuel rockets on their way to the stars. On the same scale of time, it feels like yesterday we were still building our first fishing tools. Whereas nowadays, we are crafting beautiful violins and pianos to perfect the sound. Or to come closer to our industry, it feels like yesterday we were attaching a wire to a kite in a thunderstorm to discover electricity, only to witness the rise of the AI a few centuries later. Our human needs have been constantly evolving, but so did our responsibilities too. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mihai. I'm an engineering manager in Backstage at Spotify, and I'm here to talk about how our industry makes no exception to that evolution. The state of developer tooling, for that matter, followed the same suit. Developers who once focused primarily on coding find themselves nowadays responsible for so much more. But the distribution of responsibilities has changed dramatically as well. Developers have to keep in mind a much higher cognitive load, how to distribute, how to scale, how to manage database, how to manage cloud spend. How does one remember all of that? This ever-changing transitioning mandates us to re-enable our developers to do what they do best, which is to innovate. But as the tools proliferated over the last decades, all these challenges compounded. The rise of the IDPs, which stands for Internal Developer Platforms, have addressed this problem. How, you may ask? Well, by reusing the tools to increase the knowledge sharing, which led to less interrupts, which leads to less cognitive load, which leads to less attrition, and ultimately to better outcomes for the businesses. So I think with that in mind, it's safe to say that the IDPs act as a force multiplier. Now, platform engineering teams have become increasingly common in organizations, and so have the internal developer portals. When now has to develop an application, they not only have to worry about that application itself, but also keep in mind things such as security constraints and compliances, CI/CD pipelines, observability, network controls, and so on. The IDP is that self-service interface that's highlighted here in blue. It's that central layer of all the tooling within that stack. Backstage is that layer. It's an open source platform for building developer portals. It was developed and created at Spotify to tame the chaos in the wake of a hyper-growth timeline in the history of our company. Since then, it has been open sourced, donated, and graduated the CNCF. CNCF is the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, also home to Envoy and Kubernetes, amongst others. It's seen exponential community growth since then, becoming one of the largest gatherings of DevOps practitioners, which actually makes me realize and reflect that Backstage, I don't think it's being created anymore. It's now being knitted, if you will, by a beautiful, ever-growing community. Our core philosophy is simple. Single pane of glass to aggregate all the information, ownership matters, and empowerment through extensibility. Speaking of it, extensibility is that front-runner power of Backstage and follows a pizza model, if you will. The DAO is that initial core Backstage open source repository available to begin with. The toppings are individual plugins that each of them add a flavor to Backstage, an individual flavor to Backstage. Whereas the pizza itself is that freshly cooked and deployed one single instance of Backstage that's maintained by one productivity team. To quickly recap, the holy grail of Backstage, if you will, consists of the following: software catalog for finding things, software templates for creating things, tech docs for documenting things, and then the last one, search, well, one search to rule them all. We recently ran an impact analysis at Spotify on over our 6,000 plus developers to try to better understand how Backstage is affecting them on their daily basis. And the results we're seeing are encouraging. We see more developer activity, we see more code changes deployed in less time, and our software is deployed more often and stays deployed for longer. That said, let's have a look at how Backstage actually looks like at Spotify. One second, I need to turn on the oven. There we go. There we go. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that Backstage is powerful primarily due to its extensible plugin architecture. It was built with modern technologies and common frameworks such as React and Node.js, and also stayed cloud agnostic and vendor neutral. Now, plugins are just added functionality, and they can come pretty much from anywhere. If you have specific needs in your organization and you have bespoke needs to implement them, you can build those internal plugins yourself. If not, you can maybe reuse some of the plugins that are already available out there in the community. So it's safe to say, I suppose, that whether you're a pepperoni fan or a quattro formaggi fan or a different kind of pizza fan, there is a little bit for everyone. Bundled as NPX packages, you can browse around the grocery store to find all of these plugins in the NPM mirrors. In this particular case, I chose the catalog, so both the front-end and the back-end plugins are available out there. But speaking of plugins, this is the homepage plugin. One of our open source plugins, highly customizable, and incidentally, our default welcoming page that all the developers at Spotify see on a daily basis. Now, one interesting fact about our internal instance is, despite it being the oldest instance there is, it's actually not the largest. I think to the last count that I've done, we roughly have around 45,000 components, which is roughly all the assets, total number of assets that we have indexed in the catalog. But there are organizations out there that have 4 or 5 times that number, which only proves that scalability-wise, actually, Backstage goes far beyond our current needs. But that said, let's go back to the home plugin. I have at first glance all the information that I need in a given day, both for myself and for my team, which in this case is Infinite Sharks. Now, I know that may sound strange. We do embrace an autonomy culture at Spotify, so we have a deliciously complicated relationship with naming things. So maybe that's a story for another time on how we name teams at Spotify, but for now, let's just assume we all love animals in Backstage. What you see here is, in the front end, is essentially just a React app. And you can configure that the way you would normally expect that to do, with a caveat that you can get a few things for free, right? You don't have to worry about navigation or how to consume those APIs from other plugins because all of that is standardized for you. Similarly, under the hood in the backend, primarily you have Node Express services, and you can define your endpoints the same way you would normally do. Now, I wanted to showcase today 3 specific plugins for you. And the first one is a simple one, yet let me increase the font a little bit. The first one is a simple one, yet powerful, because it's a visual mapping of all the technologies that we prefer and we recommend to our developers to use on a daily basis. Now, from a technical perspective, this is simple enough. It's just rendering some content in the front end, so nothing complicated there. Yet, by implementing a Backstage plugin for this, we're able to answer this question to the developers if they have that on a daily basis. Like, which technologies should they use? Now, to build on the complexity, let's move on to the second plugin. I hope that renders well. And that is the software templates. I mentioned a little bit earlier that fragmentation is one thing that is slowing developers down. Well, it turns out that another thing that slows developers down is the actual process of creation. Imagine, I just joined a company. I have a brilliant idea on how to, implement a backend system that will optimize our playlist management system or something. Now, instead of me focusing on implementing that backend, my first reaction would be, how do I cope with that in the existing ecosystem? How do I bring the network controls? How do I make sure that I have the right CI/CD pipeline set up and all of that? So suddenly, instead of focusing on what I actually have to do, I'm thinking about all that boilerplate code. In order to solve that, please meet software templates, whose purpose is to create repeatable templates. Give a simple UI in the hands of the developers, provide them a couple of the information they need at hand on the metadata on the component they want to build, and let that automation do the heavy lifting for them. Let's see how that looks like. We're going to see in a second some of the templates that we have at Spotify. Let me pause here. What you see in here are all the templates that we have internally. Let that be backend of various technologies, front end, machine learning tooling, data pipelines, mobile components, you name it. But this is just a mere subset of what it is available out there in the community. For that matter, some of the things that we actually have internally are coming from the open source and vice versa. Let's have a look at that. For the purpose of the demo today, I chose a backend in Go just because to be really fair, my skills in Go are very, very rusty nowadays. So I chose to create one of those. Any minute now. There we go. So this is the UI that I was mentioning a little bit earlier. I'm prompted to input a couple of the initial values, simple things such as defining a component name, adding a description. I plan to own this repository, so it's going to go under my own account. And then for the rest of the tooling, I'm just going to go with the defaults that the software templates provides. I can always worry about these deployments configurations later on. And there it is. What happens now under the hood is that software template. Oh, there we go, an error. Hopefully that's going to go well with an automatic retry. Excellent. So what happens under the hood in there is that all the prompted values that I've inputted earlier of that metadata, plus the preloaded skeleton, are being combined together in order to scaffold me the component that I needed. So there are two things that have happened. Number one, a repository was created for me. And number two, the associated component for that repository has been generated and registered in catalog so that I can find it later. Now let's see how this looks like in GitHub, in this particular case. So I have a fully fledged application here in GitHub, not only with the backend in Go that I was looking for, but also I have the Kubernetes manifest so that I can worry about those later. I've got a Docker file in there generated, the build files for the CI/CD pipeline, and last but not least, a catalog info YAML file, which contains the metadata needed in my YAML file so that catalog can actually register this later on. Speaking of catalog, let's look how that looks like. And this is how it looks like in catalog. So in a matter of minutes, I have a fully functional repository, and I have the components associated with that ready to be used. So now I can go about implementing the initial backend that I had in mind without having to worry about all of that boilerplate code. Now, last but not least, Spotify has its own list of plugins, if you will, that apply to every single component that we have across the fleet. One of those plugins is the Soundcheck plugin, whose purpose is to push and drive the best practices across the fleet, but not just in any way, but in a fun way. On the right-hand side, you'll see that we have multiple tracks or programs, each of them corresponding to one tech health initiative. Let that be the security compliance or the test certification. I think for the purpose of the demo, I chose the test certification one, whose purpose is to basically improve the quality by measuring how we monitor the testing within the components. You will notice that for this particular track, we have badges, we have multiple levels, and each of those levels consists of individual checks at their turn. And each of those checks can be configured. Now, the internal research has actually shown that by splitting into levels and by splitting into granular checks, there is a higher chance of adoption across the developers. Now, for those of you that have played RPG games in the last 2 decades, like I have, this should hardly be a surprise because it's basically a gamified way to drive both ownership. One second. There we go. To drive ownership and responsibility across implementing this checks. And by bringing all of this playfulness, if you will, into Backstage, we not only make the developers aware of these changes, but we're also putting the tools in their hands to actually take control of that and drive it forwards. Now, under the hood, what happens is that we actually have real-time access to the data so that we can, let me pause right there, so that we can actually track in real time how our tech initiatives going on across our squads, how many our squads and our developers spend with those tech health initiatives. In this particular case, I chose a mobile dashboard that follows our mobile components to follow their, on their road to follow across the fleet, the best practices. And you'll notice there that despite us not yet being at 100%, if we scroll down a little bit there, on the individual granular level, we've done that. So rather than go for a large change all at once, splitting into levels allowed us to gradually increment those changes and make sure that we put this value in front of the developers. Now, in conclusion, what I want to leave you with is that at Spotify, we've learned in all this time that the right set of tools, the right set of tools in the hands of the developers can actually act as a bicycle for the mind. So when we ended up open sourcing this project 3 years ago, we asked ourselves, what if instead of it being in our hands, it was in everyone's hands? But more on that, I'll hand it off to Brian.
Awesome, thank you. All right, yeah, that was amazing. Thank you so much. I always actually really enjoy how Spotify really hones in to the developer experience. And as you can see, having a full-blown Backstage built out and giving that self-service capabilities can truly change how companies work. What I wanted to mention is that to kind of dive a little bit more into the AWS side and some of the customer stories, I wanted to really mention that we truly do believe that these types of portals and platforms really can change how your organization works. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but I just want to mention, it's definitely a journey, right? I'm going to try to give a couple of good tips in a couple of minutes. One thing I do want to mention is Toyota. I'm actually very lucky. I was very close to this group, and I saw the entire journey. They started very small, which you should always do, with a group of people. And then after about 6 months, and especially treating their product or their platform as a product, they were able to actually roll this out to currently into the North America team. But a big thing that I want to mention, just kind of walking through, is a lot of times, they're a very large enterprise. It would take quarterly pushes and deployments. By using Backstage and, again, that single pane of glass and reducing that cognitive load, they now seriously can ship weekly, which is a huge change for that team. Another big thing is that while this central enterprise platform team was building out Backstage, they were working with individual business units asking where can they drive value. And so as you see on the next bullet point, they've reduced time for 8 to 12 weeks for about 25 teams, reducing the equivalent to about $250K per team. So that's spending time spinning up infrastructure, getting your repo, and also hands-on keyboard, right? Having your developers maybe focusing on something that they shouldn't have to, right? Also, one big thing is that we see a lot of customers do, but what was super important for TMNA or Toyota or Kishore, who you see on the screen, is that they wanted to really focus on cloud optimization and control. And so now, since they've launched this since 2022, they're saving tons of money, and I'm really happy that they're able to do that. And what I mean by that, by the way, with the chargebacks and kind of costs and usage reports, any person that goes to Chauffeur, which is what they call their Backstage, you can actually intersource the actual how much you're spending per catalog item, right? So basically people can see where to optimize and so on. I also want to mention too is that, again, when we see these platforms being built out, they started very small, found one team, one developers, and they started building out templates. Now, they actually have over 40 approved templates, and these things range from maybe just adding tech docs, some documentation, but also even single-page applications using something like React or Angular with all the best practices baked into the repository. Kinesis, Kubernetes, Outpost, Datadog, HashiCorp, basically helping these engineers self-service their capabilities without having to have almost no human interaction, right? You can self-service and go about your day. One thing is just to kind of, again, lean a little bit more into how AWS integrates with Backstage and how we support it. We actually absolutely love the Backstage community. It's one of my favorite communities. It's grown exponentially. And also, I just want to give a small shout out to the Backstage maintainers. They've been spending a lot of time building. What we have done is we've actually spent time building out AWS implementation on using IAM credentials within your Backstage. So you can actually assign IAM roles to your Backstage to go act on your behalf with your AWS resources and still maintaining the least privilege way that you should probably approach these things. And so this is how you're able to actually integrate with tech docs, search, Kubernetes, and also extend it to things like DynamoDB, right, and other types of tooling. We also have been building out a couple of AWS plugins, specifically having integrations to something like AWS Proton. Neil on stage actually helped build this, so he's definitely going to be talking at least a little bit more about how we think about approaching plugins. But with the AWS Proton service plugin, basically this is extending Proton to Backstage to help with your deployments and upkeep of infrastructure. Also, the last plugin that I'll mention is AWS Code Services. So this is the ability, just like that catalog info YAML that Mihai showed, you can add ARNs to it that actually point to code build, code deploy, and also code pipeline. Because again, what you're trying to establish for your developers is that single pane of glass, right? You want to keep them in that React app. You don't want 500 Chrome tabs, you want 2, right? Maybe GitHub and your Backstage deployment. Okay, so when we start kind of talking about how to build this out, I want to mention a couple of key things. When you are building out an internal development platform, make sure that you have a landing zone. I know some folks may already know what that is, but it's a very specific way of how to separate your multi-accounts so that you have ways to have compliance, security, standardization from an account level, and also other mechanisms like an account vending machine, enabled to actually have a little bit more control of your overall environment. One thing I want to mention is we will be absolutely sticking to the shared service account. That's where Backstage should be hanging out in, because what we're going to be able to do is actually spin up infrastructure in these other accounts that you see with the development, staging, and production. And then also kind of working with these AWS organizations, which you see here. So Control Tower helps here, Terraform landing zone, CloudFormation landing zone, but make sure you have this set up. All right, how do we deploy this thing? So we really thought about this for a while. This is actually the most common pattern we actually see. A lot of times, we might, we run into different folks that might be using ECS or EKS, and we really kick the ball around here to decide which one we wanted to show. But truly, this is a React app. It is a Node app. And for us, for a lot of times, we think that maybe simplicity is just the best way to go. So just to walk through, the first thing that you would be setting up or make sure that you have is going to be your DNS. It's going to be Route 53 in this particular example, but you can use something like info blocks or any other types of DNS. You would ingress into the VPC and actually hit an ELB or Elastic Load Balancer, specifically an ALB or an Application Load Balancer. You could tie Cognito here and use ACM, which is our certificate manager, if you wanted to have Cognito as your authentication. To make this simple, again, we're just making it straightforward. Like I said, the common pattern that we see most is people using Elastic Container Service and using AWS Fargate, which is our serverless compute, to run actual Backstage. Very simply, it's just, again, don't handle servers, stay under-differentiated, heavy lifting. And so that's why we suggest going with Fargate. You might have something like an auto-scaling group to help scale, depending on how many customers are coming into your environment. But nevertheless, we highly suggest sticking with something like ECS Fargate. To connect to the different parts of the functionality that Mihai just showed, we highly suggest using Aurora or RDS for Postgres, specifically trying to use serverless options to help keep the Postgres database in a highly available fashion. Also, we highly recommend connecting OpenSearch to the actual search capabilities to Backstage. There's a lot of things that we see here. Out of the box, when you just launch Backstage, there's usually something that's running that's called Lunar. It's good, but it doesn't have that kind of enterprise search that a lot of folks may be kind of used to with something like OpenSearch serverless. I also do want to mention we are considering integrating with something like Kendra. So you can have multiple data sources, say like Confluence, S3, SharePoint, and you can actually search everything through Backstage, right? Single pane of glass. Last but not least, good old S3. We highly recommend to store all your tech docs into S3 for the high availability. You can turn on intelligent tiering if you want to save some money, but again, I highly suggest storing everything in S3. Quick note, you would have to actually set up your CI/CD pipeline. so that it would pick up your docs folder and compile them and actually deploy them to S3. So you would have some CI/CD build here. And also, one last comment, definitely make sure you're using Secrets Manager and hiding your secrets, or using something like Vault. We've been talking a lot about Backstage. I want to kind of mention a little bit more, which is kind of 2 additional personas that we see. And in fact, a lot of times, the most amount of questions we really do receive is actually, how do you do this? Like, how do you actually get this going? And so I'm going to try to kind of bring that up a little bit. As many of you may or may not know, platform engineering has really taken the world by storm. I think a good way to put it is basically having a focal point inside your organization and pushing people through that focal point to enable DevOps at scale, specifically through automation and self-service capabilities. Normally, there will be a platform engineering team. They probably may already exist inside of your company or startup. They're usually a builder's tool team or developer experience, maybe DevOps or SREs. We usually see a 2-pizza team style, which is about 12 to maybe 14 folks working together in different aspects of the platform. What they would do then is actually define that platform as much as they can in either Terraform or anything in infrastructure as code, and anything that would be scalable or meant for your organization. So this might be a Kubernetes, Helm charts, or again, ECS, whatever have you. There is still a architecture review and a security review, right? You want to build in these best practices for the actual platform, maybe using something like a well-architected review or framework to establish these high availability and best practices and cost optimization. But nevertheless, there's still going to be some type of review. And then storing everything into Git. Git operations or GitOps is your best friend. And also, too, there's a lot of new changes coming to Backstage where now you can actually have declarative infrastructure for your front ends as well, right? So the Backstage maintainers are heading this route. This is important because you will have version control, you can have auditability, and if anything blows up, you can just pull and go backwards and roll back. When we look at this actual platform itself, I want to mention a couple major things. Obviously, you would have some type of cloud that would help you on your cloud journey. So this might be AWS, this might be on-prem, this might be edge, but nevertheless, your cloud strategy and having some type of computer cloud at the bottom. We already talked about landing zones a little bit, but this is a good way to have segregation of accounts, control of your accounts, and how you would be deploying these resources into these various things. Next, we see tons of different types of orchestrators. So you would need some type of orchestrator to actually be able to spin up the 2 rows above it. So normally we'll see, Kubernetes, maybe something with Crossplane. We will see Terraform, Cloud Development Kit, CloudFormation. These tools would be able to spin up infrastructure on the right-hand side. I guess that would be your left. And basically, also able to connect into those different 2 rows, right? So these orchestrators would provide tenancy, CI/CD, observability, ingressing, and so on. Finally, as we've been kind of talking about, Backstage as a developer portal would sit on top of this platform. As we joke around, it's kind of like putting lipstick on a pig, right? You're trying to make it pretty, you're trying to make your platform look nice, but more importantly is abstraction. You want to abstract all this complexity away from your developers. What I normally also see, too, is that when you get started on this journey, most folks will actually pick developers first. They will find one team, how can we improve your life? They will take DORA metrics to actually prove out value, not only to more teams that may join later, maybe your leadership, or maybe just for yourselves or the developers that are using it. But definitely, they start getting these feedback loop mechanisms and measuring them. Once you start onboarding more developers, what I also normally see is the builders start coming in. And this is kind of just at all, almost, but this could be your DevOps, SREs, whatever have you, putting it in dashboards so that anybody that is technical can actually start really getting more value out of these platforms. I want to mention, too, that do not forget about your data scientist. I have a joke with one of my buddies that's part of my customer, and he told me one time, I didn't know I had to learn all this crap just to do my job. And basically what he wanted is just a Jupyter notebook. And that's a big key theme about what we're talking about here, is that instead of you learning 5,000 tools, how about I just extend my platform to you, right? And that's what we normally see is actually data scientists really get a good part and a lot of joy from using one of these portals. Last but not least, I'll make one last comment. We actually do see the entire business come to these Backstage portals. So don't forget, this could be lottie-dottie for everybody. And we actually see people tie something like Bedrock or LLM models to the actual Backstage portal as well. Last but not least, as you can kind of see here, you'd be deploying to these different VPCs and accounts or whatever you may see fit or deem fit. This is a little bit more busier slide, but I think it's one of the most important things that we talk about the most, and then Neil will definitely come on and get much more technical. But this is what we actually answer a lot about, is again, how do you do this? So we've been talking about architecture patterns, standardizations. Toyota's a good example, right? We know when you need a single page application, just use this template. Codifying your templates, right? Standardizing maybe on Terraform or CloudFormation, slowly but surely, but again, using handlebars and the scaffolder to help you there. We've already talked about the self-service portal tons and times, but more importantly is the next couple bullets. Tracking your financial operations is huge. No one wants to have a Lambda function that spins up $50 billion, right? But it's also nice to just know what you're spending. We actually see customers kind of gamifying this, saying, all right, if you want to deploy Node app, you could pick a serverless or you can pick containers. This is the cost difference. You will actually see them coming to serverless. Obviously, this would be set up how you would deem fit for your cloud strategy, but we'll also see, just like Mihai just showed, that people will gamify this, right? So whatever team may have saved the most amount of money in a month, cool, you just want a free Echo Dot. Right? But it makes it a nice experience coming to these portals. Another big thing is that you should have your education and training actually part of these portals. And so what you're trying to really do is build a community. The last thing you want to do is go spend 6 months building out a platform that no one wants to use because you shoved in tooling. Sometimes we'll actually see folks say, for example, this gentleman right here, he made a cool new project, saved the company billions of dollars. He's a superstar. Well, cool. Get him to write a blog post. Have a blog post section on your actual homepage and show that there's some awesome work being done within your company, right? Build by your team for your team to solve your cloud problems. Organizational change and management. What I mean by that is RBAC. Certain teams getting only certain plugins or maybe functionality. Certain teams only getting certain functionality. Maybe again talking about guardrails, paved roads. And then also, of course, future innovation so that you and your teams can actually spin up AWS accounts, go play around. Some customers will slap $200 or something on an account. Once it's done, delete the account. But again, you're helping enable innovation. While you're building out these platforms, the three actual orange, look at third-party engagement, eliminate tech debt if possible while you're standardizing. You're not gonna solve everything in a day, but working towards that. And then also, again, just general cloud management. One last thing I want to mention is that we often see COEs or Cloud Center of Excellence use these platforms to get what they need done. Again, it takes a minute, but we find that this will be super helpful for teams. And last but not least is do not forget about that community. A lot of times we'll see customers, instead of just having a normal yarn start for Backstage, they will change the CSS framework, they'll change everything to make it look like, it doesn't even look like Backstage. For example, I think American Airlines calls theirs Runway, change the colors to their schemes. Zalando has Sunrise. Again, Toyota has Chauffeur. So make this for your team, build back into the product, platform as a product, and yeah. Yeah.
All right, thanks, Brian. Hey, everyone. So my name is Neil Thompson. I'm a principal container specialist at AWS. And for the last maybe couple of years now, I've been working with folks like Brian to really try to understand how AWS customers can and are leveraging Backstage to achieve what both Mihai and Brian have showed you so far. So in this section, what we're going to do is take a little bit of a deeper dive into some patterns that we've seen in talking to all these customers. So hopefully you can understand how to achieve some of these things with AWS services. and maybe take these back to your own platform initiatives. Oh, I hit the wrong button. So in general, application source code isn't all you need, right, for your workloads. Given that you're at reInvent, I imagine that some, if not all of your workloads require at least some AWS resources to run. That could be compute to run it on, could be dependencies like an RDS database or an Elasticache or S3 buckets. You generally need something. And as kind of Mihai showed in his demo, there's a few different ways that Backstage can kind of intersect with infrastructure. So what we're going to do is break down these areas a little bit more to see like what we've seen with customers. So when you bootstrap a new project, as Mihai showed, how can we get infrastructure along with the application source code? Once we've got that infrastructure, how can we get the metadata back into the Backstage catalog with a feedback mechanism? And the third one is how can we then implement the plugins that Brian mentioned earlier to show things like code pipeline in Backstage, maybe taking a little bit of a zoom out in kind of like how we build them and reference that AWS infrastructure. So when it comes to actually scaffolding infrastructure with software templates, we'll take a look at a really simple example to try to frame the problem a little bit. So we'll maybe start is a similar example to Mihai's. Maybe a developer wants to kick off a new Go microservice, right? In our case, we might deploy that to ECS. So the first thing that they'll do is they'll come to Backstage, they'll pick our carefully crafted software template from the platform team, and they will complete the software template process, and the scaffolder will kick off. This will go off and build out our Git repository. It will give us, hopefully, a fully working Go microservice with all of our best practices baked in, all of our logging, our configuration, all of that all ready to go. But ideally, we also want something like infrastructure as code, right, to go alongside that. And that can live within the same software template as our application source code. Now, there's lots of different ways that you can go about doing this. This is obviously one very simple example. Some of our customers like to store their IAC right alongside their source code. Some like to put it in a different repository. There's unlimited ways that you can basically put this together, but we're just going to use this as a really simple example. So you could essentially build your software template with your code and something like a set of Terraform. So out of the box, the developers are ready to go. In our case, we'll use AWS code pipeline and code build for our CI/CD process. You could use whatever tool you want here. Obviously, organizations tend to have pretty strong opinions on this area of their tech stack. And this is obviously going to build, test, and package our application. So maybe something like building a container image and pushing it to ECR. But once it's done that, we also want it to provision all of our AWS resources as well. And essentially, it's just applying our Terraform, our infrastructure as code, to get, ideally, everything the developers need to get all the way to production without having to raise any more tickets or do anything else. Now, again, we talk to a lot of customers who have separate pipelines for their infrastructure as code, or it runs in a separate process. That's not to say that you can't do that here. Again, we're just trying to keep this example really simple, but this is the most common pattern that we see. The main thing that we're touching on here is that when you're running through the scaffolder in Backstage, it's not provisioning resources itself. It is relying on your existing CI/CD tools and infrastructure as code to do that infra provisioning. And although there's nothing technically feasible from stopping you from running your Terraform in the scaffolder, it's not designed for that repeatable infrastructure evolution as you constantly change your infrastructure. So ideally, Backstage is seeding this repository, and then your existing tools are doing a lot of the work. Now, a lot of the customers that we talk to find value in, once that infrastructure has been provisioned, helping their developers understand how it relates to the infrastructure components that it belongs to. So in terms of what Mihai talked about in terms of ownership, we want to model not just the software components, the infrastructure dependencies, but also the relationships between those so we can understand what belongs where. So Backstage comes with a rich entity model out of the box. So earlier we saw a component in that catalog info YAML to model the component itself. We can also model resources and the relationships between them to get this relationship view essentially out of the box if we do it correctly, right? This is built into Backstage. And if you build out these entity models correctly, you get this on every application page. So how do we actually make this work? In this case, this is a resource kind. So we saw the component kind earlier. This is an example of a resource. And the intention of the resource kind is exactly what we're using it for here. Now, this isn't any sort of definitive example of how to use this. These are flexible entity models, but this is an example of what we've seen work. So in this case, we're maybe modeling an RDS cluster that a team is using for their application. We're going to use annotations to add extra metadata that might be useful for whatever purposes. So maybe the ARN of the resource, so we can uniquely identify it, the name of the database, the region, whatever is useful to drive other capabilities in your Backstage, you can add here. And if you've used Kubernetes a lot, which we see quite a lot of crossover, this will probably look very familiar in terms of overall structure, right? Especially the annotation section jumps out and the kind. So the entity model is modeled after, at least in spirit, the Kubernetes entity model. So you'll feel pretty at home here if you've used Kubernetes. Finally, at the bottom, we're going to make sure, importantly, we get those relationships. So you can see here, we've indicated the team that owns this resource for that ownership model, and we've also specified a component. So we're saying that the catalog API component owns this database. And this, essentially, when combined with a component, is how we build up that relationship view to get that component that we saw on the previous slide, and Backstage will just do the rest of the work for you. Now, one of the first questions I kind of had when I looked at Backstage was, so how do I actually feed that back, right? It's all very well me showing you a bunch of YAML. We saw how the scaffolder works, but if the infrastructure is codes creating the infrastructure, how do we know what to put back into Backstage? So this is essentially the question of how do we fill this feedback loop here, right? We want to get that metadata back in, and we don't want to do it by hand. So one approach that we've seen work across a few different customers is essentially exporting some form of infrastructure metadata directly from the CI/CD system, either to an intermediate repository like an S3 bucket, maybe a DynamoDB table. Some people have an API that sits in the middle. But essentially, we want to get that metadata out either directly as the YAML or as some intermediate format. And once we do that, we can actually just rely at that point on core Backstage capabilities to do a lot of the work for us. So Backstage has a great set of features termed catalog discovery, where it can ingest metadata from a whole bunch of different places to build that catalog up from disparate data sources. So it can pull from Git repositories. It can pull from S3 buckets. There's a whole bunch of integrations that you can find in the Backstage documentation, and it supports S3 out of the box. So we can throw this metadata into S3. Backstage will regularly pull all of that metadata in, and that means that your catalog is evolving along with your infrastructure, and you're not really doing a whole lot of work. So this is a relatively simple approach, but it seems to be working for a bunch of the customers that we've talked to. We do actually also have a blog post that covers this approach mostly. So TravelLoa is a customer that we have who is using Backstage in production. They were kind enough to write up their experience in terms of how they feed back metadata into Backstage. In their case, they are exporting OpenAPI specifications that they use with AWS API Gateway into Backstage to build a developer portal that basically builds itself from the infrastructure as code in their deployment process. And at that point, developers in their organization then have the ability to find APIs, understand the OpenAPI specifications, which Backstage can render using something like Swagger, and learn how to consume them. So this is an internal API portal for their developers. The last area of infrastructure with Backstage that we're going to touch on today is something that could probably be a talk in itself, which is building plugins that maybe display something about AWS resources in Backstage. So Brian mentioned earlier that we have a couple plugins that we produced over the last couple of years for Proton. This is our AWS Code Services plugin, specifically the code pipeline integration. You can see here it's showing the execution history of a given code pipeline for an application. It's available in a CI/CD tab in Backstage, which is one of the default tabs you get in the application view, it's just empty. So we provided essentially an implementation of this tab to pull from code pipeline so that teams can see the status of their CI/CD process without even leaving Backstage. We also built an entity card, which is more of a summary view that can go on the overview. But this is an example of a concrete example of how we're integrating Backstage with AWS services using plugins. We have an endless amount of ideas for other integrations. So if you have integrations that you've been wanting to see, please come and talk to us afterwards. We'd love to hear ideas. We've heard some surprising ones. Now, in terms of how we actually relate the component to AWS infrastructure, generally the pattern that we've been using is to leverage the annotations section of the component, and it's a pretty simple approach, which probably surprises no one. It just leverages the ARN of the code pipeline. When the page renders, the Backstage plugin basically checks for the existence of this ARN. If it exists, it queries the API, and we built a React plugin for Backstage that displays the component that you just saw. Now, this ARN approach for identifying AWS resources is very straightforward. It certainly works for a lot of the initial use cases, but as we talked to more customers about this plugin, or the plugins in general, we figured it becomes quite hard as your infrastructure scales, right? A lot of people have, even code pipeline, have multiple code pipelines for a single application, right? So we don't really want to comma separate a bunch of ARNs in here. So, as your infrastructure grows, as your AWS accounts get more complex, this starts to run into some scaling issues. So between the resource feedback mechanism that we touched on and the annotations, we've got a couple of areas where customers are having to put in work, and there's some friction with some of the approaches that we've taken ourselves. So one of the things that we are looking at AWS right now and talking to customers about is, are there more generic ways that we could publish integrations that can solve both of these problems using services like AWS Config, which can aggregate all of your resources across all of your AWS accounts, across your organization, into a central place. And that would give us, for example, the ability to say, I want all the code pipelines that are tagged with catalog API in your AWS definitions. It would also give us the opportunity to do things like what's called a custom entity provider for Backstage. So we can extend that catalog discovery with specific AWS integrations that understand config and can just ingest straight from config without any intermediate repositories or anything custom, which is one of the downsides of the approach that we've seen customers in the approach that we saw earlier. So again, if this is something that you you've sort of thought about or are wrestling with in Backstage if you happen to be using it, again, we'd love to hear your experiences. We hear so many different perspectives that it would be great to hear yours. The second pattern that we're going to look at is similar to what Mihai showed earlier, right? So this codifying checks and guidance. Basically, how can you surface feedback from your organization on your best practices directly to them so that they can align with them? Now, this idea of shift left that Mihai talked about, essentially giving developers responsibility, it really becomes critical to codify these guidelines and make it so that your developers can understand what do they have to implement and measure how much they are adhering to those measures without someone else tracking it for them. So examples of these can be things like code or documentation quality metrics, things like SonarQube, for example. It could be measures of whether you're building secure workloads. It could also be operational readiness checks, right? Are you ready to go to production? So the great thing about Backstage is that it really lets us contextualize this information from an app view instead of seeing account-wide or even organization-wide sets of information. It really reduces it down to something more consumable. There's a couple different plugins you can use to build these sorts of checks into Backstage that are available. So the Tech Insights plugin that you can see on this screen is available in upstream Backstage. You can install it in your Backstage and get up and ready to go, implementing custom checks. And the second plugin we'll suggest would be SoundCheck that Mihai showed earlier. In terms of governance on AWS, there's obviously a ton of services you can use to build these guardrails and to build best practices and have them implemented and checked. where we see Backstage really enabling this is that contextualization, right? So instead of seeing all of the security hub checks for everything in your organization, can you open an application in Backstage and just see the security hub findings for that app? This could also apply to things like the well-architected tool, right? Identify architectural risks. And it really just allows us to take all of that stuff and pull it into that single pane of glass that developers don't need to leave. One example that we heard from customers that kind of surprised us, I didn't think about this one, was the well-architected tool. So, they were asking to be able to use the well-architected tool to define their architectural risk profiles, capture that from their workloads through questionnaires, and basically be able to display that feedback directly in Backstage, either through something like a UI widget, so this is just a custom entity card, or integrating with something like Tech Insights, so you get more of a checklist-style view. So this is, again, something that we're looking at is, ideas for whether it's Security Hub or the well-architected tool, what services would you be interested in seeing here? And we're hoping to publish out plugins like this, in the coming year based on what we hear from the community. The final area that we're going to touch on real quick is cost optimization. So essentially, it's unsurprising to hear that customers are tired of having their FinOps teams chasing around developers telling them to spend less money, and they want to shift that left as well. So in order to do that, we need to tell developers how much they're spending, but ideally, we want to tell them actionable ways that they can reduce the cost to, and not just leave it up to them figuring it out. So the Cost Insights plugin that you can see here has a bunch of capabilities, but the two main ones that we care about are exactly those ones we talked about. It can show the development teams how much they spend, and it can also give actionable recommendations. So you should migrate this workload to Graviton to save cost performance. Now it's up to you to provide that data. So Backstage doesn't understand AWS. It doesn't understand your infrastructure provider. So we need to implement the Cost Insights API, which essentially comes empty out of the box. Thankfully, this isn't too difficult. We get a TypeScript contract that we can fill in with our own set of data. And actually doing that is something that we're trying to provide potentially more of an opinion on. We'd love to be able to provide a default implementation of the Cost Insights API that uses something like the AWS cost and usage reports in order to aggregate this cost information from all across your organization, and at that point, Backstage can just send Athena queries. So this is the same stack that's used by cost intelligence dashboards, if you're familiar with that from AWS, as well as things like KubeCost in the Kubernetes ecosystem use the same set of data. And what you can end up with is something like this. So we've prototyped this integration showing things like a per-service breakdown for a given application over the preceding month or 9 months or however it is. This is just one example of how you can segment the data. At the end of the day, you have the whole curve to play with. You could segment by environments, by regions, by account IDs. It's really up to you. There's tons of possibilities when you combine the flexibility of Cost Insights with the ability that you can just query whatever you want from the cost and usage reports. It's a pretty powerful combination. So to recap what we've talked about today, we looked at empowering innovation and experimentation using software templates for not just your application source code, but your infrastructure as well. We talked about reducing the developer cognitive load by feeding back things like the infrastructure into the Backstage catalog, along with various other aspects. The surfacing of best practices, organizational guidelines, and helping our developers adhere to those is super critical, as well as enabling cost optimization and crowdsourcing that to help your organization save money. Some parting thoughts. Getting started, Backstage.io, best place to go. Documentation on Backstage itself, overview of its features. That will inevitably lead you to GitHub, which obviously is where you'll find the code. We are also showing a demo at the Modern Applications and Open Source Zone. There's a couple different sessions. I know we've been teasing a lot of integration in this session. That was partly on purpose. So if you want to see a lot of this stuff actually working, please drop by to one of these times, and at least one of us will be there, whether you just want to talk about Backstage or you want to see any of the things that we've kind of touched on today, we're happy to dive a lot deeper than we've been able to in this session. This is where you can find the Modern Applications and Open Source Zone. It's over in the Venetian. In the expo hall, there's a section sort of in the back right-ish where you can find all sorts of experts on these topics. The expo is open, the same hours as the expo is where you can find folks there. But with that, we are going to close off this section on Backstage. We're really glad that you spent the time with us today. And if you have any questions, please come up to the front afterwards, and we're happy to chat. Thank you.